Hi, I think we're ready to get started. I'm Ann Rieselbach, the League's Program Director, and I'd like to welcome you to the Architectural League's FF Distance Edition, a rework of our New York City studio-based First Friday program. During this contradictory time of physical dislocation yet virtual connection, we're taking the opportunity to visit practices across North America who expand disciplinary boundaries by taking on multiple roles, coupling architecture with initiatives including design advocacy, fabrication research, and community engagement, or all of the above in the case of agency, who you're going to hear from. Tonight, we're visiting Ersela Kripa and Stephen Mueller's studio, located in El Paso's Grand Daniel Burnham Design Union Station, which also serves as the base for Texas Tech's architecture program, where Kripa is serving as acting director, and along with Stephen directs the Study Center host project for creative spatial technologies. This location, sited in close proximity to the US-Mexico border, quite literally situates much of their work of their interdisciplinary practice with its focus on contemporary concerns through the lens of architecture, urbanism, and advocacy. Kripa and Mueller tackle architectural and research projects at a variety of scales, from local to geopolitical, such as their recently published Fronts, Military Urbanisms in the Developing World, which examines how military training sites provide ways to better understand the shape of the city to come. Despite the pervasive injustice, inequity, and ecological instability that agencies' research probes, there's perverse optimism that guides their work. They describe the exponentially increasing capacity for innovation in architectural thought and production, including emerging technologies, communications, and models of practice that offer a new generation the ability to identify and transform the most pressing urban and ecological issues through design. Their work successfully tackles this dichotomy, I think. Following Ersela and Stephen's presentation, Iker Gill, the director of Mass Studio and the founder and editor-in-chief of the nonprofit Mass Context, as well as executive director of the SOM Foundation and the co-curator of this year's exhibit, Columbus, we'll follow up with some observations and questions, and then the discussion will open to everybody. I hope at that point you'll turn your cameras back on if you've got them turned off. It's meant to be active. You can do this both by commenting, raising questions in the chat section, or by raising your hand and simply speaking directly, which actually we hope will happen because this is meant to be a more informal gathering. So with that, I think we'll start. Thanks.
Hello. Here we are. Everyone can see my screen and hear me? Yes, all right. So thank you all for joining us tonight, and thank you to the Architectural League for visiting us, and to Iker Gill for agreeing to have a conversation with us tonight. Welcome to the border, as you see this image here. For this unusual studio visit, we've organized our thoughts around the character of the place where we live and work, and not around single projects. So we saw some real serious architects in the participants list today. We're not going to show any build projects, but we'll share some insight into this context, which we use as our studio or our laboratory for a number of related initiatives. We'll include some of what the work is on the boards right now, which is very much in progress from our practice agency and our academic research at Texas Tech University, and some of our teaching, which are all supported and challenged uniquely in this place. We live and practice steps from the US-Mexico border in the El Paso Ciudad Juarez region, where public space and public life is continually threatened, where geographies are defined and organized by a pervasive security apparatus. Our context is a frontier in multiple ways, where human, material, and ecological flows come against blockages and destruction enacted by evolving security technologies that infiltrate the rest of the nation. This is the militarized landscape of the borderland, and it is really our office and our reason for being here, to enact alternatives to this kind of damaging and divisive use of infrastructure. This video here you see is our daily commute. We filmed it earlier in the day because it's dark now, but this is driving along the international border fence. It was built after the Secure Fence Act that was established in 2006, and by 2008, we have 57 miles of border fence in El Paso, mostly along the channelized Rio Grande River, which serves as the international boundary. So you can see homes in Ciudad Juarez in Mexico across the riverbed, and then you get glimpses through the natural landscape as border agents enter and exit the no man's land. Very recently, a new highway was built, an American highway that straddles the border fence. You see here, parts of its structure are on the south side of the fence in the no man's land, with commuters hovering above this area between the fence and the river. So it's common to see Border Patrol apprehensions in this area here as migrants who make it past the fence face an impassable infrastructural landscape with multi-layers of railway, fences, and highways. And then as we bear to the left here on the highway, you see our building at the Texas Tech College of Architecture, the brown brick building that we'll show a little bit later, which is where we teach. In our border dispatches, which was a series for the Architects newspaper, we've been closely tracking changes in the built environment of the US-Mexico borderland since the last presidential election. And the border line has become a protagonist on the national stage with Trump's administration, as you all know. Some sites we've documented and continue to monitor are especially indicative of our interest in the region. The violent collisions of multiple jurisdictions enacted by militarized landscapes and infrastructures like this. This is the 0.8 mile long border wall that was built by Steve Bannon, for which he was indicted, with crowd-funded funds on private land. The wall had to be built on a 60-foot deep fill of earth that destroyed an ecologically important arroyo, or a valley, and it's complete with the latest underground sensor technology and overhead surveillance and a 16-foot wide sidewalk for Border Patrol vehicles to drive alongside it. And the private wall here abuts the American Dam, as you see, where the fence material changes from this rust color to the silver. The American Dam down here in this view, it's over the Rio Grande, which is particularly low today. This is federal land and is managed by the International Boundary and Water Commission. And this private wall has blocked access to federal employees who need to maintain the dam. And the last time we checked, they were in a lawsuit tangled over the access to this area. So this is an important intersection which we pass on our daily commute, where logistics hit the ground in complex ways, where international water treaties are enacted, where local, national, and international jurisdictions of varying scales and goals meet, and where global flows of capital begin. For instance, products that are assembled in the free economic zone in Juarez, south of the border, are transported via this rail to the coasts in order to be shipped all over the world. And so, but what does this mean for architecture? In our essay titled Patently Immoral for the Architects newspaper, we wanted to understand how the wall was built within 2 weeks' time, and it was built secretly. And they state that it was done so in order to avoid environmental studies and protesters. It turns out Fisher Industries, the company that has been courting Trump via Fox News appearances, built this wall as a proof of concept prototype in order to show that they can build it faster, cheaper, better. And they can do this because they've patented a specific technology that will not only give them a leg up in the competition for the larger contract of the bigger border wall along the entire border, but it'll make them money every time anyone else wants to use it. And so the patent implicates the architectural discipline in the construction of the wall and the destruction of the borderland. So as architects, we modeled digitally all the components described in the patent drawings as a way to make the disciplinary aspects of the approach more legible, visible, to understand the scale, depth, and staging and sequencing of construction. So, and to understand how this may affect our discipline. The patent calls for a steel bollard fence, as you see here, that acts as a foundation and superstructure at once. This invention has since enabled the rapid construction of miles of border fence through environmentally sensitive areas, through indigenous land, and is contributing to an ongoing lethal humanitarian crisis at the border as migrants continue to seek alternative paths through more dangerous and deadly terrain. So we imagine, because of its efficiency, this militarized construction method will likely soon creep into civilian construction projects, and we caution our colleagues in architecture and the construction industry to boycott the use of this and similar technologies which are designed to exclude and to render the territory lethal. In addition to the ports of entry, we also document the detention center in the US, which map a series of shadow logistics infrastructures that are enabled by the border wall. And they are run for profit by private contractors, and they are in remote juridical urbanisms where they can exploit their off-the-map status to disenfranchise detainees. This is a study in 2009 by the Department of Homeland Security investigating itself that criticized these facilities because they criminalize immigration as if it's another kind of crime. And so many sites of detention are now privately operated by firms and individuals who actually came up through the penal system. And with this profit-driven model, their selected sites are becoming more highly specialized because then they can make more money this way. And it becomes a network of nodes in the national business of deportation. This is one site we have documented and visited. This has become a departure gate for a secretive airline that shuttles people to Mexico 3 times a week, 160 passengers on a flight, regardless of whether they are from Mexico or not. And organizers describe this to us, the success of the architecture in terms of processing bodies. They call them bodies rather than people, in a really efficient manner. They are built in prisons and also using prison logics, rendering an architectural type complicit in the inhumane treatment of migrants. So these are some of the spaces that, as you can see, don't really vary from prisons. As we develop our research, generally what we do out here is we try to broadcast quick photojournalistic pieces in order to combat the political misinformation about the border. This essay in particular documented what Amnesty International reported at the International Criminal Court is a practice that was illegal by international law. Namely, using the political boundary you see here marked on the ground, the line between US and Mexico, as a geographic place where they were turning people away before they can reach a formal port of entry to declare that they're seeking asylum. So this blocks all due process and doesn't give anyone the chance to reach immigration authorities or show paperwork. So we rushed to the site and we sort of photo documented that this was happening. But even for people who cross daily with paperwork, the bridges are at the whims of national moods. Last winter, for instance, the president decided to make crossing even more difficult for daily crossers, empowering agents to ask extra questions, to enact unnecessary searches, and sometimes to detain people for reasons that were not even cause for detaining before. These tactics made lines longer, as you see here along the bridge, and discouraged people from crossing, severing this binational community in half. And in some cases it worked. And so since then, we've worked recently with Amnesty International to visualize the dangerous overcrowding and mismanagement of federal and private immigration detention facilities, which has contributed to disproportionate rates of COVID-19 infections in this already vulnerable detainee population. So we mined documents that Amnesty recently obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request, and we were able to confirm, geolocate, and categorize 200 federally operated detention facilities in the US and analyze their capacity as well as their average detainee population, pinpointing those that were dangerously overcrowded, especially for this pandemic. And so if you go online, our interactive web map of the facility summarizes the findings in graphic overlays while providing searchable and zoomable facility level data in support of the Amnesty report. And if you zoom even further and close enough, a layer of aerial images shows the physical properties and the architecture of these buildings. The report ultimately advocated for the release of migrant detainees from detention sites so that they can avoid contracting COVID-19 while they wait for their immigration paperwork to be processed.
So in addition to the work that you've seen in our practice and agency, we lead parallel investigations through the research center we've recently established and we direct at the Texas Tech College of Architecture called POST, the Project for Operative Spatial Technologies. The center considers environmental and biotic vectors that transgress the international border and shape contiguous transboundary territories. With the ongoing pandemic, the securitized territory is being actively reshaped. Over the last several decades, the US has articulated an expansive geography of biosurveillance, which networks an extensive collection of public health laboratories, monitoring stations, and state security sites to detect, monitor, and respond to biological threats to its citizens. But now the legal and physical boundaries of the state are blurring and expanding within this emerging securocratic territory. At the physical limits of the state, at the border, biosurveillance is enmeshed in the federal border security apparatus, forging transnational alliances for biological monitoring. Surveilled health crises in border cities become politically expedient tools to opportunistically push aggressive immigration agendas. The US Department of Homeland Security is claiming that the rapid deportation of what they call illegal migrants is saving the lives of US citizens, while deportation is contributing to increased cases of COVID-19 abroad. The borderlands is viewed by national security officials as particularly vulnerable to biological threats. So the borderland becomes a fragile site of experimentation for testing forms of transnational biotic governance, raising questions of sovereignty beyond the bounds of the nation state. The borderland has historically witnessed extreme, invasive, and damaging border health measures deployed mostly on Mexican nationals by US officials who view what they call foreign bodies as suspect. During the Bracero program, for instance, the US Public Health Service routinely conducted physical exams of migrant workers entering the US, screening for tuberculosis and sexually transmitted diseases, and embarking in what they called a program of disinfestation by spraying workers with DDT. In El Paso, workers were subject to gasoline baths before being allowed to cross. With the current pandemic, new infrastructures of biotic governance are emerging in the borderland. Recently, so-called disinfectant tunnels have appeared at ports of entry in Nogales and elsewhere, and effectually, and in fact dangerously, spraying aerosol disinfectant on people who are entering Mexico from the US in an effort to sanitize pedestrian border traffic. The response is not only federal, other more bottom-up models of response are emerging within the urbanized border. In Ciudad Juarez, for instance, so-called filter hotels are cropping up, which are volunteer-run spaces serving deported migrants needing a space to quarantine. Our recent investigations in the center within POST have focused on understanding the sites and infrastructures currently in place and along the international boundary which enact this national biosurveillance infrastructure. The borderland was hit hard in the early waves of the pandemic through the early summer, in part because of the disjointed public health infrastructure and response mechanisms between the US border states and their Mexican counterparts. Here we begin to see the limited lab support in major border cities. While the few public health labs along the border contribute reporting to the national biotic security of the domestic interior, the borderland itself is actually underserved by testing and response sites. In this mapping of the rate of transmission of COVID over the summer, we can actually see the resulting intensity of infections at the border. The asymmetrical distribution of local monitoring sites and response led this summer to growing uncertainty of transmission rates at the border. And this uncertainty actually was later used to support sweeping reductions in asylum claims and more aggressive deportation procedures. Our work, as you've seen, seeks to forge identities and promote dialogue across both real and imagined boundaries. Another vector that's instrumental to this kind of work here is the conception of transboundary atmospheres. A number of dynamic and often highly polluted airsheds span the US-Mexico border, co-producing complex environmental effects with transboundary populations and binational urban centers. Our context is defined and controlled by layered jurisdictional borders where mineralized infrastructures delineate local and regional areas, while the atmosphere actually transgresses these boundaries. Our region is defined by a so-called dusty season, which pushes particulate matter across the international border and other jurisdictional boundaries, problematizing the environmental monitoring of these areas while endangering public health. Despite our shared air basin and the shared problems that we face with our neighbors, the jurisdictional fragmentation obscures the common issues within our urbanized valley. Atmospheric inversions together with the colors of the high desert sunsets make some of this visible. You can see the ecological distress that this region is suffering together. And it creates conditions like this that can last for days within the spring and other windy months. These atmospheric jurisdictions, like their terrestrial counterparts, are themselves defined by borderlines. And while some atmospheric administrative borderlines are drawn to coincide with and therefore reinforce the existing geopolitical constructs like national borders or city limits, for instance, others intentionally remap the territories below. In the center, our critical cartography of aerial territories reveals competing attitudes of contemporary airsheds to the jurisdictions that they help to forge or to subvert. We've uncovered an air monitoring regime which reinforces the national borderline. The travel of airborne particulate into and within the US has long been considered an existential threat to our national security. Since 2003, under a program called BioWatch, a national biosurveillance program, federal authorities in the US have enlisted air monitor stations in secretive locations. Every day, a large team of public health officials test samples of inbound air and scans for microscopic airborne threats to national airspace. But the precise geography of this BioWatch program is a closely guarded secret. Our mapping of the BioWatch geography extrapolates the likely jurisdictions based on our close readings of congressional hearings, government reports, and local news coverage, which have revealed so far only incomplete lists, and this our best guess at the map. Next, we explore the myriad multi-jurisdictional atmospheric administrative constructs within national airspace, which assemble otherwise disjointed state and county authorities in the service of shared environmental action to see what we share with other metropolitan regions within the country. As aerial territories consolidate and compound, they form entirely new geographies beyond the limits of traditionally conceived urban extents, creating what we can describe as airshed megaregions, forging new administrative and political collectives bound by shared atmospheres. Several of these control regions actually cross state lines. While the majority of these involve only 2 neighboring states, there's several tri-state regions and even a 4-state region. As urbanization and sprawl continue to blur the lines between adjacent cities and their suburbs on the ground, extending urban form into extensive megacities, city regions, and megaregions, a similar phenomenon is visible in the chains of adjacent multi-state environmental control regions. So you see now that we have 2 fundamentally different geographies of atmospheric assessment, this subdivision of national airspace in order to reinforce a sovereign boundary and an aggregation of urbanized environments which meets the border as an artificial limit. But here in our region, in the Paso del Norte, these 2 atmospheric constructs actually exist simultaneously. And it produces a hyperbolically atomized transnational air basin amidst significant environmental, urban, and demographic transformations. Our airshed, or airsheds, span and subvert the boundaries of multiple national, state, and binational jurisdictions in a complex patchwork. Environmental and atmospheric management here has to contend with 2 countries, 3 states, and 2 cities. The asymmetries in the reporting frequencies between all of these jurisdictions, as well as our standards, protocols, and systems of measurement at a number of scales, leaves divided, disjointed, and discontinuous data sets that don't capture public health risks. So we seek to better understand the effectiveness of the monitoring jurisdictions for the populations they are meant to serve and define the discrepancies between discontiguous airsheds and contiguous populations. Here, we're looking at the location and the reach of air quality monitors throughout the borderland. Each type of sensor actually monitors a different scale of the atmosphere, from the micro scale to the urban to the regional. And by extrapolating the range of these environmental sensors and sensor networks, we can actually start to assess a density of monitoring and a scale of resolution that's serving or not serving the borderland. And we find significant disparities in investment and resolution throughout the urbanized border, and several blind spots, importantly, in the atmospheric sensing regime, which leaves underrepresented atmospheres and underrepresented populations at risk beyond the gaze and the focus of the monitoring jurisdictions. In our practice and agency, we design interventions and representations to address similar issues of environmental justice in the region. Here, we've developed an extensive collection of Arduino-based sensors and have been installing them on both sides of the border in order to build our own hyper-localized data sets to combat this kind of blind spot condition. And we produce these drawings that track particulate matter across the international boundary over time. These are flows that are otherwise invisible because of the divisions in the jurisdictional framework of air quality monitoring.
And from this, the hyperlocal and regional frontiers, we actually zoom out to global fronts at a very different scale. A recently published book, as Anne mentioned, collects our original research, writing, mappings, and speculative drawings that concern the many fronts we see impacting global cities. So the book actually zooms out and looks at typologies across the world. And from our current location, we've been able to document how the US military constructs these fronts. Here you see us witnessing a training in progress where the tank is crossing the desert. You saw that quickly. Fronts, we suggest, are different kinds of global transnational spaces. They're new constellations of cities and urban patterns developed from the agonistic interchange of security and development pressures. Although its constituent parts may be geographically distant, the front is bound and shaped by a set of common characteristics. The book uncovers a growing geography of secretive simulated cities built on military installations to train combat troops in urban warfare. And by scraping a disjointed public record of congressional hearings and appropriations, and as well as military construction budgets, we were able to identify, geolocate, and document over 500 of these sites. And what we found is that these simulated urban environments, the city combat training sites, are becoming more and more urban in character. As they attempt to increase the realism to effectively train for the use of force in dense environments, the military is now developing its own extensive urban inventory. It's a shadow urbanism, achieving a density and variety of buildings and infrastructures that steadily approach the diversity and intensity of real-world cities. The sites are stand-ins for city forms that military seek to dominate, and they become excerpts of global urbanism. While sites are becoming more urban, the opposite is also true. Real cities that are once inhabited are becoming training sites, increasingly used to simulate the fabric of a future urbanized war. Here, for example, we see the town of Playas in New Mexico. That was a suburban American town abandoned after the copper industry failed, and its suburban homes are now repurposed as simulated Afghan compounds with, you see here, with compound walls just kind of surrounding around the side yards of the former suburban American homes. The book dives deep into one particular simulated city form, the Combined Arms Collective Training Facilities, which the military calls the CACTIF, which is the gold standard of urban warfare training, where infantry, tank, and air operations can simultaneously be deployed. We've located over 30 of these facilities and can learn a lot about how the military's posture toward urban environments forms from our deep analysis of their architectural and urban forms. And so this typology mandates the replication of certain urban and architectural typologies that we've modeled and drawn. We've identified 6 spatial types that you see here that are common to the developing world, and they're also commonly simulated in these and other simulated sites. The camp, the zone, the dump, the graveyard, the squat, and the jail. Oops. There we go. Our Simulated Cities database, presented in the book and soon available online as the first publicly accessible geolocated database of these sites, allows us to better understand the urban and architectural forms that are commonly targeted and deemed suspect or even criminal. We can identify familiar forms amongst the urban clusters and the outliers. Our database reveals that the architectural designs are copied with only very slight variations on multiple installations, as you can see here. So we gain the ability to identify each building type and its prevalence across the widespread geography. An intentionally repetitive and predictable assembly of urban forms, architectural types, and material systems are deployed throughout the geography of simulation and done so by design. And so, as we've seen, this was a really quick recap of the book. A large number of secretive urban simulation sites have propagated and evolved over the last several decades. All signs suggest this shadow urbanism will only continue to spread. These sites are more than just a collection of urban simulacra. They're spatial mechanisms for exerting state power. From this position on the simulated sites, a militaristic viewpoint of our collective urban futures is continuously absorbed, rehearsed, and ingrained, threatening to project back into the world and shape cities in its image.
So we thought we'd end with a quick tour of especially the school and the immediate surroundings. So we teach at Texas Tech University's El Paso campus. This is far from the main campus in Lubbock, located here in the Union Depot train station, steps from the border fence. It's actually a Daniel Burnham building built in 1906, and it's still a functioning train station. So Amtrak operates passenger trains out of the lower floor. As we pan left here, you can see layers of infrastructure that we drove past earlier, from the rail yards, the border highway, and the elevated highway, creating this kind of thick boundary around the campus between the station and the international border. And this is ever present. Many of the neighborhoods in Juarez that you see here nearby still serve a still booming maquiladora industry. The homes here dot the foothills of the Juarez Mountains. They are modest and informal homes built when Juarez expanded under the promise of low-wage work under NAFTA. Most of our students are bilingual and bicultural. Many of them have grown up in Juarez and moved to El Paso later in life, or still have family in Juarez that they see regularly. This is the same area, just a change of seasons. The same area across from the Texas Tech campus in its springtime dusty season where visibility is dramatically reduced. The station itself is on the National Register of Historic Buildings. It's home actually to a new master's program in historic reservation. We continue to grow. This is the main space where we would have loved to have welcomed you all if we weren't virtual. It's often filled with our students and with passengers commuting through West Texas to Los Angeles or San Antonio. The college lecture halls and seminar rooms are just off this main space, which creates funny scenarios where sometimes passengers waiting for a train will mistakenly walk into one of the lectures in search of the vending machines and get a kind of free course. I guess they're auditing the course. The upper levels here are the former railroad offices, but now they've been converted into the architectural studios. Sadly empty now as our students are all working from home. But the students enjoy sort of this chain of rooms at the top here connected by all the former communicating doors of the railroad offices. Our students are constantly making, and we're surrounded by their models. We're actually running out of space. This is our main space outside of our offices and the library where students study, where we have pinups and sometimes informal classes with community leaders jumping in. In this main kind of encounter space, we actually donated our agency project, our selfie wall, after it was decommissioned. And here you can see us working with two of our students who we hired to install it as part of the school. So it became a kind of didactic, full-scale model that reiterated some aspects of learning as we teach them about prototyping and digital fabrication, sort of at a smaller scale in class. In our courtyard, where historically a segregated restaurant used to be when the train station was used more frequently before desegregation, we have all of our school gatherings, including graduation dinners and cookouts with our students. It's really a communal atmosphere. So you have to imagine this filled with students and faculty at various times, but that's the footage we got for you today. And here we're back with the selfie wall. So the selfie wall was installed just the semester before the pandemic, and it has not had a chance to be used or sort of lit again. But it's installed, you see here at the left, just above our 3D printing shop, which is part of the school, which is also currently closed due to the pandemic.
And speaking of the 3D printing shop, right after all classes migrated online in March, we turned our attention towards 3D printing PPE. This is the very beginning of the PPE architecture school efforts nationwide, and also was the most terrifying part of the pandemic because it was also the beginning and we didn't really know its conditions and its spread. So we were the only faculty allowed in the building and used every hour of our spare time to make hundreds of face shields with our printers running around the clock. So this once busy space became really desolate overnight and turned into the space where we spent many hours locked up. Everyone, I'm sure all of you were really afraid to be outside. And so here you see one of our dogs, Sophie, just going crazy with cabin fever and entertaining herself back and forth while we were printing. And also while other architecture schools had robust teams where they set up assembly lines, in El Paso, because we're such a small program, it was mostly me and Stephen, which meant that we had to fabricate all parts of face shields. So here you see our PETG station where we're cutting big pieces to laser cut later for the front piece. Again, Sophie going crazy. But we used the leftover filaments that we had from our own projects because filaments were really in short supply at the time. And this kind of became our signature. And then we ended up ordering new filament that was in these fun colors because we thought maybe this kind of alleviated the strangeness of the pandemic. And we were also our own deliverers. So this is our private car, and we were delivering these to hospitals in El Paso. And then after all hospitals said that they were well stocked, we moved on to making respirators. This is the model for Maker Mask. But respirators take a long time to assemble, producing these kinds of long, boring hours with our dogs. And then we found a really efficient mask that we ended up making hundreds of for the Navajo Nation. We shipped these to 4 First Nations reservations in New Mexico and Arizona, and they reached out to us through social media when they had seen that we were making PPE. And so our dean was happy to help us ship these with funding. And then at the end of the summer, we received the directive that we had to figure out a way to teach some of the studio in person. And so we went to work. This is Stephen here. As you can imagine, because our studio spaces are so small, because they are just the former offices of the train station, they are not conducive to air ventilation, and the windows are not easily operable because they're wood and they're historic. So we decided to teach outside. We have 330 days of sunshine and very little winter. And so we ended up using half of our parking lot, and we marked it with the physical distancing of 6 feet apart. And we felt we were ready, and we started a studio this way. So here's everyone in studio. What we were able to do is to still try to maintain that kind of nature of studio, or the culture of studio, of printing physical drawings and making physical models. But obviously we can't shout, right? And we can't hear each other outside. So we were all plugged into a Zoom conference call where everyone was plugged with their headphones and their iPhones. And so you could actually hear and focus on each other much better than even before Zoom. And so we also have students who are immune compromised and could not show up in person. So simultaneously with the pinned up drawings, we also pinned up on virtually on Mural. And so the Zoom call would allow the students at home remotely to see all of the drawings that were being presented in physical space. And so this kept everyone really in communication. And when the weather doesn't cooperate, especially when it's windy and drawings get flown out of the parking lot, we can have our classes in the main train station space, and our studio days do not coincide with train days. And so this allows for a really quiet space. And also because this is a symmetrically designed floor plan, we were really benefiting from opening all 4 doors across from each other and created a lot of cross ventilation for safety. And so we'll end with a quick drive around downtown. Our school is located in downtown El Paso and has a really interesting collection of great buildings. Most of them were designed by the architect Henry Trost, who was a Louis Sullivan apprentice. So you'll see a lot of that style here. Across, you'll see here, this is kind of a drive through another block. This is an Art Deco building that's actually famous and is going to be renovated. This park, San Jacinto Plaza, is very much used all year round for games of bocce and ping pong. And then we just passed this beige building here. You see it's the historic Cortez Hotel where JFK stayed the night before he went on to Dallas where he was shot. So that's a kind of a sad moment in our history. And this is kind of the last video zooming around downtown again. The Plaza Hotel that you see there is the first Hilton Hotel, where famously the actress Liz Taylor stayed. She lived in the penthouse when she was married to the oil tycoon. There are buildings that are renovated to the right. Again, San Jacinto Plaza. The city is very much really enjoyed by people, pedestrians, but most people don't live downtown because it's still kind of Texas. And so people drive here and then they enjoy the downtown area. And right up, coming up, we have our very own, which is my favorite building. This is our very own Flatiron building. It's a little wider than the Flatiron in New York, but it is very similar, and then we really enjoy it. So for that, we hope at some point in the future, y'all can make it down here because it's a really fantastic town.
Thank you so much, Ersela and Stephen, for the great insight into your work, into all the efforts that you've done throughout the pandemic, the border condition. It's incredible to see what you do and also like what you, where you practice. Thanks for the Architecture League to invite me to moderate this conversation with Ersela and Stephen. I have followed their work for several years, was lucky to be part of one of the reviews with their students in El Paso, and invited them to lecture in Chicago a couple of years ago as part of Mass Context. Earlier this year, Mimi Zeiger and I, in our role as co-curators of Exhibit Columbus, we invited Ersela and Stephen to be part of the next edition as University Design and Research Fellows to create an installation in Columbus, Indiana next year. So we're very interested in the rigor of their work, the clear agenda that they have defined throughout the years, how their work can be an instrument of change, and the importance of being directly connected to the place in which they develop it. So we're looking forward to seeing how they think and how they intervene in a place like Columbus, Indiana. So in the interest of time, I just want to bring a couple of questions before we open up the conversation in the chat, but I want to talk about 4 topics that I think are relevant in their work: the idea of place, translation, methodology, and audience. So I'll jump in right away. So you studied, lived, and taught in New York, then went to the academy, the American Academy in Rome, and moved to El Paso. I'd like to know a little bit about your practice and your focus and how it has changed and evolved as you position in those cities.
Wow, so they are 3 very different cities, right? New York, Rome, and El Paso. When we first started our practice in New York, because New York is it's so remotely located to the issues that we were interested in. We used that time for in-depth research. We wrote a 150-page draft of our manifesto and of our outline of what agency should be working on and what agency should not be working on. And so we enjoyed, we were very lucky to receive a few fellowships where we actually had the time to just focus on what we might do. So we wrote that book, and then in Rome, we were able to to spend the year focusing on one of the chapters of our goals from that manifesto. And that was looking at the relationship between institutionalized racism and very specific urban tactics by the Italian government, namely with the Roma population, otherwise known as gypsies. So that work and that year allowed us to really understand sort of how to be part of a place, and how living in that place really affects the way in which the research is conducted. When we first went to Rome, we were just super excited and super young and started photographing everything. And then we actually, when we developed relationships with local activists, we realized that unless you really live somewhere, the work doesn't, the impact of the work is not really deep. So after that, we see Chris Taurasi, one of our former students here in the crowd at WashU, Washington University in St. Louis. We ended up in El Paso through this road trip while we were in St. Louis teaching at WashU with students, and just discovered the El Paso Juarez region and absolutely fell in love and did not want to drive back. Like, we just wanted to move here not knowing anyone or anything. And so we were lucky enough that Texas Tech had tenure track positions advertised. We applied. We luckily again were offered them. And so being here, what that has done is really made the book a lot bigger. It was 150 pages, and then after 3 years here, it became 600 pages. So that's half
big,
of what's
very
big.
Pretty small type.
It's really small font, and that's half of what's actually in the draft. But because we could drive to these places, and we could meet with military and interview them and really collect the data firsthand, our research became really tethered to place and a lot more place-based, and just grew so much. So we feel incredibly lucky, and we feel that this place has given us so much. So that's kind of, I think, yeah, like the character of each city where we lived in actually helped to shape the work.
Great. So talking a little bit more about the idea of translation, like your work looks at emerging and transnational geographies. In many cases, they are either invisible or like purposely hidden. Those can be military networks, economic flows, air quality, or informal settlements, as you talk about earlier. So can you talk about the challenges of translating these geographies into outcomes that can be rendered visible? Like, what's the, how has that determined the way you work, also the way you, like the mediums that you use to do that? Just kind of like that translation. Let's talk a little bit about that part.
Sure, yeah, and I think the invisibility of the aspects of the contemporary city and the kind of territories that we're investigating, that invisibility kind of happens on multiple registers, right? Like the phenomena themselves might be invisible, whether it's particulate flow, and there are actual optical problems to being able to observe, the kinds of pollution that have deleterious kind of health effects, right? Like it could just be a kind of literal invisibility, but in other aspects of our work, the invisibility is the difficulty in obtaining, well, first finding the sources through which the information that would illuminate the phenomena might be available, and then actually gaining access to those sources. And in lieu of being handed, for instance, a single document that describes the entire spread of the military geography that we're interested in sort of counter mapping, we often have to find I guess, analogs or proxies to kind of stand in as evidence of the effects of the phenomenon that we're trying to track, right? So, you know, we mentioned in the slides a couple of times, just like the mining aspect of, you know, digging through a series of largely unrelated types of sources, you know, whether they're official sources or unofficial sources, whether they're compiled, you know, lists and locations of things, or whether they're just journalistic or anecdotal accounts that we need to sort of follow up on and ground truth in order to understand if they are, you know, true news or fake news. There's a lot of challenges, and it kind of depends, I think, from project to project about how we tackle the visibility. But I think in every project we are intentionally targeting the invisible, because we've become sensitized to some impact that the invisible is having on the city or on our health or on our neighbors, right? And we find it that through our training, as you know, having training in spatial reasoning, geospatial analysis, and these sorts of things, like we can actually sort of daylight some of these issues and maybe make legible some of the issues to people that can use our data. And I guess the other aspect of the invisibility then is like the question of representation. Like, how do we, once we find it, right, how do we represent it, and how do we make it legible and hopefully actionable by or with a community that we're hoping to serve? And I think we're, you know, it depends project to project, but we often, similar to how we work in our built practice, when we're thinking about fabrication and we're thinking about you know, ready-made objects and the appropriation of space or the appropriation of objects in order to enact a kind of transformation of a space. In our visualizing the invisible work, we're also interested in sort of the appropriation of other representational techniques from other disciplines or from previously established forms of representation. So, for instance, in the research center, and also in some projects in our practice, we've thought about like the ways in which atmospheric effects have historically been communicated to broader publics, like looking at things like star charts, for instance, as a kind of model that we can address by layering through other technologies, whether it's AR and VR or other kind of simulations. If we can use a model that people sort of intuitively understand from their, you know, from a night at camp, you know, 20 years ago or 30 years ago or something, then maybe the translation, you know, of the data that we're trying to gather and the issue that we're trying to convey will connect through the kind of appropriated medium that we're kind of using in that instance.
Yeah, I think it's really remarkable, the ability that you guys have to translate some of these ideas into either the book form, the research, the essays for Architects newspaper, like the installations, the objects. So I think the like how you navigate between that set of data sets and then all of a sudden trying to turn that into other outcomes, I think is just really, really remarkable. Just want to kind of like remind everybody that you can have time to ask questions. You can send it through the chat or raise your hand. So don't be shy. We're here for that. There's one
Elaine
here.
has a question.
Elaine.
Oh,
You have to unmute yourself. Yeah.
Here, I muted. Hi, Ursela. Hi, Stephen. It's great to see you.
Hi.
Hi. Thanks for the great talk. So I know you just finished a book, And that's, you know, still sitting right here. But I was wondering if what new thoughts are evolving from the work that you've done to now, and what might become a next area of focus for you.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a good question. If everyone on this chat doesn't know, Elaine is from El Paso, so she could probably check all of our history that we just shared.
Thanks for the tour. That was really great.
So thank you for that question. So now that the book is out of our minds, not really, you know, there are two trajectories. We're working on a second book, but that is more sort of a collective effort that will collect the Border Consortium, which is another initiative that we started here as part of our research center to really create synergies and collaborations. I think Herman Payares is here. I think he was there. That highlight all of the research and the work that's being done and the design work that's being done along the border, the entire US-Mexico border, working with colleagues from the US and from Mexico institutions, so that the next book is really highlighting a much larger collaborative effort and stitching these kinds of information gaps, and sort of creating maybe what, you know, Michael Deere talks about, the third nation, but sort of evolving our own knowledge about this region. So that's kind of on the book side. And also in terms of built work, we are working to find ways to render, as Iker was just mentioning, physical and visible through shading devices, these kind of inequalities of air quality and shade availability. We're finding that there's a direct relationship between the quality of the air and the particulate matter that's in the air and shade and sunlight. And so here, as you probably know, Elaine, through your growing up here, but because there's so much particulate matter in the air, we get a lot of diffuse UVB and UVA radiation that still affects people in shade. So even when you're in shade, you're actually not protected. But also shade is not available near the border crossings or in really underserved communities. So we have this enormous mapping project, and we've invented a grasshopper script that kind of analyze urban environments through that lens. So we're trying to figure out, how do you take like all of this kind of GIS mapping exercise and make it a shade structure that's like, you know, okay, big, you know, but not as big as the maps, right? So we're sort of working with both ends of our brain right now in terms of publishing more collaborative work and then designing the work that allows the maps to like hit the ground.
That's amazing.
Yeah, and I think in general, with the book on the shelf for the time being, you know, these other aspects of our practice that are pretty interventionist and hands-on, I think we'll begin to find some room to grow again. You know, the book was a heavy lift, I think, for the last several years to really just button that up, and I think we're looking forward to sort of getting our hands dirty moving forward.
I think Paul Lewis has a question. Did you raise your hand?
Yeah, first of all, thank you for the kind of amazing tour of the details inside and then the landscape outside. I was fascinated by the way in which you use architectural representations to make things that are not supposed to be legible. And I'm curious, one of the things about doing that is architecture drawings seem to connote a sense of fact, and which is what gives them their power. And I'm curious, one, if you've had any pushback, organizations, governments, military who don't want these things drawn, or pushback because they believe that the way you're drawing them are somehow inaccurate. Be curious to know just if that end, if you've had consequences from the acts that you've done?
We, so far, the book's only been out a few months, so it hasn't happened yet. The most conflicts we've had are when we're kicked out of sites that we're not supposed to photograph. And we always have like the 2-camera system, you know, like there's like, here's the camera you can wipe and there's the one that you can't see. But so that has been the most conflictual. And then when we've entered the detention center and the military bases, the companies that organize or run them and manage them are really glad to talk to architects. I think they see us as not threatening and as mostly interested in the space. So the hours of interviews we have recorded, they really are just so excited to tell us about the building and how the buildings manage these bodies, and they don't see us as a threat in any way. But we don't think our book has hit their shelves yet. And a lot of the information we represent and draw is publicly available, but it's publicly available in a 1,000-page congressional hearing. And so the way we're stitching it together, it makes for a much more comprehensive or a readily available picture, but it's none of that information is secret. There are questions about the photography and the videos, but we haven't really been asking for permission. I think the biggest resistance we receive is from the architecture community, because there's always the question, the 2 questions: architecture, is architecture political? Should it be political? And then, this is not the architect's job. I don't know, whatever the issues are. I think that's when we present our work, that's mostly where we find a little bit of pushback, more so than the military industrial complex. But thank you, we're big fans, so I'm so excited you're here.
We have time for one final question, if anybody wants to say something. Okay, I'll ask. I have one question about the idea of the methodology, though. Like, super interesting the difference between the idea of the precision and the skills that are needed to gather all the information and work with all the sets of information that you have, but also like how that translates into what you've also called like unskilled labor to do a lot of the installations and to make those happen. So if you can talk a little bit about that, those 2 levels of skills that you need to operate in your practice.
Me? You?
Yeah.
I think on the unskilled labor side, we make architectural drawings of everything, every installation we do, and whether they're like elevations or plans, and they're always direct translations of a digital model that has measured coordinates and locations of each unit, and everything is CNC milled to precision. So we do a lot of our own testing, and then we work with our students a lot here in El Paso, and the idea is to make a foolproof set of drawings so that all of the unskilled labor, including ourselves and hands, can finally come together within really small tolerances, and so that's where we really put on our architecture hats, and we're really serious about the how to make drawings, right? They're not necessarily representational drawings. They really are like the field instructions drawings. And at the larger scale, a lot of the research that we do before a project relies heavily on mapping and on modeling software and in prototyping on our own. And that we've been able to just teach ourselves over the years. We went to graduate school at Columbia, where really what we learned was how to think critically, but we didn't necessarily, it's not a trade school in terms of tools, right? And so we've had to teach ourselves. So with every new project, we get really excited because we say, oh my gosh, we need to learn AI, go, you have 2 weeks. And so we are total dilettantes, and we don't specialize in one tool, and the tools are completely besides the point. we're just constantly sort of learning and on our toes and trying to figure out what, whether, like as Stephen was saying, the star map, like how to draw a star map, how to draw dust from like Earth up in this kind of like in a volumetric spherical way. And then, so we have to talk to geologists, and we have to go to the observatory and talk to the astronomers over there. And then we come back and then we run that through like a CNC map drawing set, So it's also a huge benefit of being here, because I think we're within 2-hour driving distance of all the tools we need. And this context has been incredible that way. It's been a teacher for us.
Yeah, and I think there's another aspect of the precision in our work, I think is front loaded. It's like precision, born out of all of the research and all of the kind of observations of the context. I think we try to be the most precise in identifying the question, right? And identifying the kind of targeted area for intervention. And then we try to be very open to allow for multiple voices in the making of the intervention or in the crafting of the response, right? I think there's kind of a dual aspect even in, the conception of our firm, naming it agency, right? It's not that we're sole authors having agency in the transformation of these environments, but we're hoping to leverage our disciplinary precision, I guess, in order to amplify the agency of others in transforming their own situations. So there's anyway, yeah, this idea of front-loading precision and then letting things evolve is I think in all of our work.
I think we're after actually 8 o'clock. So I'd like to thank Ersela, Stephen, and Iker for being here and sharing your work and your space and the borderland that we can barely conceive of from up here in New York. And Iker, for your questions. We don't have any programs next week, but we do have one left in 2020, and that's on December 15th with Walter Hood presenting some work, and then in conversation with Mabel O. Wilson and Mario Gooden. So I hope you'll all revisit the website, and thanks for joining us tonight.